night the steamroller died, nobody heard it scream. Because machines don't scream. It just stopped on the red dirt road, right in the middle of nowhere between Igbara-Oke and Ilesa, like an animal that suddenly refuses to move. The boiler hissed, the metal cooled, and the air filled with that sour smell of wet coal and hot oil turning cold. A young driver climbed down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and did what any working man would do. He checked the pipes, the bolts, the valves, everything that could betray him in front of his crew. Nothing was wrong. Then a voice hit him, not inside his head but in the air, a sound like a river smashing rocks, calling his name again and again, as if the sky itself had lungs. And here's the part that makes people lean in and also pull back at the same time. Years later, the same young man would stand in the middle of crowds so dense you could smell their sweat and fear, and people would throw their protections into fires, bundles of feathers, bones, small leather pouches stained dark with old sacrifices, watching them melt and blacken like they'd finally admitted what they were. A prophet? A threat? A man of God? Or a man whose story is so intense Nigeria still argues about him while still honoring him? Stay with me. Because Joseph Ayo Babalola's life doesn't begin with a pulpit. It begins with dust, discipline, and a road that would split his destiny in two. He was born on April 25, 1904, into a world that was already divided, not just by rivers and kingdoms and colonial borders, but by invisible loyalties, the old gods and the new churches, the shrine and the hymn book, the village night and the Sunday morning bell. His family lived in Odo-Owa in Ilofa, small-town Nigeria, where everybody knows your father's name before they learn yours. His parents were part of the Anglican Church, and his father wasn't just a casual attendee. He was the kind of man people called church father, the one who helped hold the place together when faith wasn't fashionable or easy. And around Babalola's birth, stories gathered the way storm clouds gather. People said something strange happened in the sky. A violent sound like an explosion that shook the clouds. Whether that was literal thunder, village memory, or the way people narrate meaning into a child's arrival, what matters is this. From the start, his life was treated like a sign, but a sign doesn't grow up feeling like a miracle. A sign grows up as a boy, with chores and expectations and the quiet weight of being watched. He went to school, pushed forward as far as his circumstances allowed. Not the clean, polished education of elite Nigeria. This was practical schooling, interrupted by life. And life had its own curriculum. Learn to endure, learn to obey, learn to work. At a certain point, he left formal schooling and moved toward a trade. He tried his hand as a motor mechanic apprentice. Grease under the nails, sharp tools, engines that either obey you or humiliate you. If you've ever worked with machines, you know why that matters. Machines don't care about your feelings. They reward patience and punish arrogance. But the path didn't settle there. He eventually joined the Public Works Department, PWD, where colonial Nigeria's roads were being carved into the land like scars and signatures. Roads meant control. Roads meant commerce. Roads meant the future arriving whether you invited it or not. And Joseph Ayo Babalola became something very specific. A steamroller driver. Picture it properly. A young man in work clothes, hands steady on the controls of a loud, heavy beast of iron. The steamroller didn't glide, it pressed. It flattened stubborn ground into something that could carry weight. It was hot, dirty work, coal smoke, sweat, and the constant rhythm of mechanical force. He wasn't preaching to crowds. He was flattening earth. That detail, steamroller driver, sounds like trivia until you realize what it shaped in him. A steamroller driver learns timing. If you rush the machine, you break it. If you hesitate, the work stalls. He learns to keep moving even when the heat tries to cook your lungs. He learns to ignore the noise and focus on the line ahead. And the line ahead, back then, looked like stability. A government job, a regular wage, something you can hand to a future wife and say, "We will be okay." In a country where okay was never guaranteed, that mattered. So when later generations talk about calling, understand what calling had to fight. It wasn't fighting laziness. It was fighting a man's need for safety. Because even as he worked, the world around him was boiling spiritually. Prayer movements were rising. Christians were questioning the imported forms of faith that seemed allergic to African suffering. People wanted a God who didn't just promise heaven later, but power now, healing, deliverance, protection. At the same time, older spiritual systems still pulsed through the villages. Shrines, charms, oaths, secret societies. Some meant comfort and continuity, some meant fear and control, and some were both at once. And between these worlds, a young worker could feel pulled even without understanding why. Babalola, by many accounts, wasn't raised as a rebel. He came from church. He knew discipline. He wasn't hunting for attention like a street performer with a drum. If anything, his early life reads like a man being trained for quiet responsibility, which is why what happened next lands like a slap. One night, September 25th, 1928, he couldn't sleep. Not normal restlessness. Not too much coffee. This was a kind of internal agitation that doesn't ask permission. He lay down and his body refused the command. The hours crawled. The darkness felt too loud. Night after night it continued, for days, nearly a week, until exhaustion stopped being a feeling and became a fog. And here is the twist inside the twist. He didn't even know why. No obvious illness, no injury, no event he could point to. Just a pressure building in the invisible parts of him, as if something was approaching and he couldn't turn his head fast enough to see it. Then came the day on the road. The steamroller, his reliable monster of iron, stopped. Imagine the humiliation first. Men watching, waiting, expecting the driver to fix it. The roadwork stalled, the air thick with heat, the smell of fuel, the sense of time wasting. He checked everything. No visible mechanical fault. No reason. And in that moment of confusion, when logic had run out and pride had nowhere to stand, a voice arrived. Not a gentle whisper, not a sweet spiritual metaphor. A voice like many waters, calling him 3 times, with the kind of authority that doesn't negotiate. And the message was brutal in its simplicity. He was being called to preach, and if he refused, he would die. This is where modern viewers sometimes try to domesticate stories like his. They want it to be motivational, clean, inspirational background music swelling under the scene. But if you sit with it honestly, it's terrifying. Because whether you interpret it as divine encounter or psychological rupture, the effect is the same. A man's life being seized. He didn't celebrate. He resisted. Like so many prophets in old stories who didn't want the assignment. Because who wants to walk away from a salary into uncertainty? Who wants to become a target? Who wants to trade a predictable machine for an unpredictable crowd? And the voice didn't flatter him. It didn't offer fame. It offered consequence. That's the kind of call that doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like being drafted. And just when he thought he could harden himself against it, just when he tried to shrug it off as exhaustion or madness, the pressure didn't lift. It tightened. He knew what the next step would cost. Resignation. Leaving the Public Works Department wasn't just quitting a job. It meant stepping out of the safest lane available to him. It meant walking away from the colonial structure that paid him. It meant disappointing people who thought they knew his future. And there was someone, his superior, who tried to stop him. The head of his unit reportedly urged him not to resign, as if saying, "Young man, don't throw your life away for a voice." Because from the outside, that's exactly what it looked like. A worker abandoning sense. A young man choosing instability. A nobody choosing a path that makes powerful people nervous, because the moment you claim to speak for God, you're competing with every other authority in the room. And this is where the shadow of the future appears. His first real enemy, not yet with a single face, but with a clear shape. The world that survives by controlling what people fear. A prophet who tells people they don't need certain protections is a threat to the sellers of protection. A revival that pulls crowds away from established religious structures is a threat to those structures. A man who claims spiritual authority without official permission becomes a problem for officials, church and state alike, because crowds are power, and power makes rulers allergic. Babalola didn't have a title yet. No apostle. No crowds. No legendary revival. But the fuse had been lit on that road. And the most dangerous part wasn't the voice itself. It was the choice that followed. Because once you say yes to something like that, even once, you don't get to return to your old life unchanged. The road never looks the same again. The steamroller never sounds the same again. The night never feels quiet again. So there he stood, a young man covered in dust and heat, staring at a machine that refused to move, with a voice still ringing in the air like a verdict. A stable future behind him, a terrifying mission ahead. And the question hanging over everything like a blade, if he obeys, what will it make him? If he refuses, what will it take from him? He didn't resign with a speech. He resigned like a man stepping off a cliff without knowing what kind of ground waits below. No parade, no drum, just paperwork, awkward stares, and the quiet shame people feel when someone chooses a path that makes their choices look too safe. The steamroller stayed behind, iron, heavy, obedient. Joseph Ayo Babalola walked away with nothing you could measure in your hand, except the kind of fear that keeps you awake even when you're exhausted. And that insomnia that had been gnawing at him, it didn't vanish when he quit. If anything, it turned sharper, like the night was testing whether he truly meant his yes. At home, the air changed around him. In places like Owa and the towns nearby, people don't just watch you, they interpret you. A young man leaves a government job. The village starts writing stories before you do. Some said he had lost his mind. Some said he had been bewitched. Some, more dangerous, said he had discovered a way to cheat destiny and didn't want to share it. His family felt the tension first. Not because they didn't believe in God, his household was already church-going, but because they understood the social cost of becoming the one who hears voices. In a world where rumors can become verdicts, a calling is also a target painted on your back. And still, he didn't run back to his old life. Instead, he did something that sounds simple until you try it. He went into prayer like a man going into a furnace. He prayed in the morning. He prayed at night. He prayed when his body begged for sleep. He prayed until prayer stopped feeling like poetry and started feeling like work. Heavy, repetitive, humiliating work. The kind that shows you how small your confidence actually is. This is where people usually expect the story to turn glamorous. They want instant power, instant crowds, instant miracles like fireworks. But the early days of Babalola's calling were not glamorous. They were lonely. Because the first thing a real calling does is strip you. It removes your old identity before it gives you a new one. It forces you to stand in the gap where you are no longer who you were, and not yet who you'll become. He fasted. He withdrew. He listened. And that listening was dangerous, because the more he listened, the more conflict sharpened around him, especially from two directions. One direction came from the world of traditional spiritual control, the sellers of charms, the keepers of rituals, the men whose authority lived inside fear. They didn't have to shout. They didn't have to fight him openly. Their power worked best in whispers. He is insulting the ancestors. He is breaking the old protections. Let him try. We will see. The other direction came from inside the church world itself. Respectable Christianity, organized and cautious. The kind of religion that prefers God to stay polite, predictable, and safely far from the messy realities of sickness, poverty, and spiritual dread. And there, Babalola's first true human rival emerged. Not as a cartoon villain, but as a man with real influence. A respected church leader who believed Babalola was about to set fire to everything. He didn't introduce himself as an enemy. He arrived as a concerned guardian. Let's call him what the people called him, Reverend. Reverend was the kind of man who had papers, training, and a collar that signaled authority. He knew how to speak smooth English when needed and formal Yoruba when it mattered. He had a church that looked like order, benches lined, rules lined, voices lined. And to Reverend, Babalola was chaos. A young man with no formal theological certificate claiming he'd been summoned by God. That wasn't only questionable, that was a challenge, because it suggested that heaven might bypass the gatekeepers. So Reverend did what gatekeepers do. He tried to close the gate with wisdom. First he warned him privately, then he warned him publicly. Then he began to frame him. He said Babalola was arrogant. He said Babalola was dangerous. He said Babalola was trying to start a new movement for attention. And that was the seed of rivalry, not only between two men, but between two ideas of faith. One faith was respectable, the other faith was risky. One said, "Be careful." The other said, "Obey." Babalola did not win that rivalry with arguments. He wasn't built for debate. He didn't have the polished vocabulary of a trained cleric. But he had something that, in those days, mattered even more than eloquence. He had a kind of severity that made people feel God was near. His voice wasn't sweet. It was direct. When he spoke, it sounded like a man delivering a message that could not be edited. He began to move from town to town, speaking wherever someone would let him. Small gatherings at first. A few listeners. A few skeptics leaning in with arms crossed. Some came to mock. Some came to test him like a strange medicine. Let's see what happens if we swallow this. And what happened wasn't neat, because the moment he started preaching seriously, preaching repentance, praying for the sick, calling people away from spiritual bondage, he collided with the deepest nerve of the region. Fear. Fear of sickness. Fear of infertility. Fear of sudden death. Fear of unseen enemies. Fear of curses you can't point at. People didn't just want a sermon. They wanted relief. And in that hunger, his message found oxygen. He preached the kind of Christianity that insisted God was not far away. He spoke of Jesus not as a distant painting on a church wall, but as a living power that could break chains right now. Chains on bodies. Chains on minds, chains on families. That's when the first reports began to spread. Not one spectacular miracle that everybody agreed on. Life is never that clean. But a pattern of stories that multiplied in whispers. A fever broke after prayer. A crippling pain loosened. A person tormented by nightmares slept peacefully for the first time in months. A household that lived under constant dread suddenly felt quiet. And as soon as those stories spread, the rival forces hardened. The charm sellers saw money slipping through their fingers. The ritual keepers saw authority slipping. The careful church leaders saw control slipping. Even Reverend, who had dismissed him, began to feel a cold pressure in his chest. The pressure of crowds drifting towards someone else. Because rivalry isn't always hatred. Sometimes it's panic. Now Babalola could have tried to soften his approach to win them over. He could have played politics. He could have said, "Let's all work together." But something in him refused compromise. Not because he enjoyed conflict, but because he believed his assignment was urgent, and urgency makes enemies. He joined prayer networks and holiness-minded groups that were already stirring, communities of believers who were dissatisfied with a powerless, decorative faith. These were people who emphasized prayer, healing, holiness, and the expectation that God still acts. That alignment gave him structure, yes, but it also gave his critics a sharper weapon. "See," they said, "he's part of those extremists, those people who talk too much about miracles, those people who embarrass the church." Reverend began to use the ugliest kind of spiritual propaganda. He didn't merely disagree. He suggested the power Babalola carried might be dark. That accusation is a knife in religious communities. It doesn't just attack your reputation. It makes people afraid to even stand near you. And for a moment, just a moment, it worked. Some people stopped inviting him. Some crossed the street when they saw him. Some women pulled their children closer as if holiness could be contagious in the wrong direction. Babalola absorbed that social rejection like a man swallowing bitter herbs, but he didn't stop. Instead, he leaned harder into the very thing that frightened everyone, prayer that looked like warfare. He would rise before dawn. He would walk alone. He would find quiet places, bush paths, edges of farms, spaces where the world couldn't interrupt him. He prayed like someone holding onto a rope while a storm tries to pull him away. And in those seasons, his life tightened into a kind of discipline that offended ordinary comfort. He was not building a brand. He was building endurance. Then came the moment that turned suspicion into obsession. Because one day, word reached him that a young man, someone known in the community, had fallen mysteriously ill. Not the kind of illness you easily name. Not a clean fever that runs its course. This was the slow, ugly kind. Loss of strength, hollow eyes, nights of agitation. The family had tried remedies. They had tried rituals. They had paid for protections. Nothing held. This is the kind of situation where everyone watches what the new preacher will do. If he prays and nothing happens, they'll laugh and bury him in ridicule. If he refuses to pray, they'll call him a fraud. If he prays and something happens, the whole region will tilt. Babalola went. He didn't arrive like a performer. He didn't demand payment. He didn't stage a show. He prayed directly, intensely, like a man speaking to an authority he expects to answer. And the story that spread afterward, again, in many versions, because human memory is messy, had the same core. The person improved, not magically perfect in an instant like a movie cut, but undeniably better. Better enough that people couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. Better enough that the family's fear cracked open into hope. That one event, and a string of similar events afterward, did something dangerous. It gave ordinary people permission to believe that God could confront their most private terrors. And once people taste that hope, they become difficult to control. So, the pushback escalated. Traditional spiritual figures began to set traps, not always physical traps, sometimes social ones. They'd challenge him publicly. If your God is real, come here, pray here. Do it in our territory. Reverend Circle began to isolate him within church spaces. Invitations were blocked. Rumors were planted. The goal was to starve him of platforms until he either softened or disappeared. But in trying to choke him, they made him more interesting. Because nothing advertises a fire like people gathering around it to argue whether it's real. Soon, crowds came not only for healing, but for proof. People wanted to see with their own eyes. Is this man authentic? Or is he another spiritual salesman? And that's when the second twist hit. Babalola was not merely confronting sickness. He was confronting the economics of fear. When he preached repentance, he didn't stop at stop lying or stop stealing. He attacked the hidden contracts people kept with darkness, the small objects kept under beds, the buried items behind homes, the whispered oaths. And this is where you can feel why the beginning of this story creates mixed feelings. Because some of what people brought out wasn't cute folklore. It was disturbing. Old pouches that smelled like blood and herbs, bundles tied with hair, charms that people admitted they were terrified to touch, objects passed down like heirlooms, but carried like curses. Imagine the heat of a fire at the edge of a gathering. Imagine people stepping forward, hands shaking, to throw in the very thing they once believed kept them safe. The leather curls. The feathers flare. The smell is awful, like burnt animal hide and crushed plants. And the crowd is half crying, half cheering, half horrified at themselves for ever trusting it. That scene, again and again, was like a public divorce from fear, and it made enemies furious. Because to the rival powers, Babalola wasn't just preaching, he was dismantling a whole system. So they did what threatened systems always do. They tried to discredit him before he grew too large. Reverend arranged a confrontation, one of those polished, civilized confrontations, where you smile while you stab. He called Babalola into a meeting with other leaders, framed as counsel, but designed as a trap. They asked him to explain his doctrine. They asked who authorized him. They asked whether he was claiming to be greater than the church. And when he didn't bend, when he didn't perform humility the way they demanded, they pronounced him dangerous. The message spread. Do not follow him. But the people had already seen too much. And here's the cruel irony of spiritual movements. The more leaders warn people away, the more curious people become. Now the crowds weren't only hungry for healing. They were hungry for rebellion. rebellion against a life of helplessness. Babalola's inner world, meanwhile, was paying the price. Because the voice that called him hadn't promised comfort. It had promised assignment. He began to realize something that would shape the rest of his life. If he truly walked this path, he wouldn't only face human rivals. He would face invisible resistance, too. Moments when prayer felt like shouting into a locked door. Moments when fatigue pressed on him like a hand. Moments when fear came not from outside, but from inside, whispering, "What if you misheard? What if you're wrong? What if you die like the voice said?" And he would answer that fear the only way he knew, by obeying anyway. By the time this season ended, he was no longer just that former steamroller driver. He had become something the region couldn't categorize, a man whose life looked like a moving storm, bringing relief to some, chaos to others, and forcing everyone to choose a side. And the rivalry with Reverend, once quiet, was now open, because Reverend understood the truth too. If Babalola's movement kept growing, it wouldn't merely refresh the church. It would replace the center of authority, and no rival ever watches that calmly. By the time Joseph Ayo Babalola's name began to travel faster than his feet, something had already changed in the atmosphere of the towns he entered. People didn't greet him the way you greet a normal preacher. They greeted him the way you greet a risk. You could feel it before you heard it, before you even saw the crowd. A road that should have been noisy would suddenly go thin and quiet, like everyone was holding their breath. Then you'd hear it, the low roar of voices braided together, prayer, gossip, laughter that sounded too sharp, crying that sounded too raw. And in the middle of it all, Babalola would arrive without theatrics. No gold, no polished stage. Often just a man in simple clothing with a gaze that didn't wander, as if he was already listening to something you couldn't hear. If you want to understand why Nigeria still reveres him, you have to understand what his meetings felt like, not as services, but as a kind of spiritual collision. Because Babalola didn't build comfort, he built pressure. The gatherings were not neat. They didn't feel like a tidy Sunday program. They felt like a storm assembling itself out of human bodies. It would start with singing, simple choruses repeated until the words stopped sounding like words and started sounding like insistence. Women would sway and clap. Men would stand rigid at first, arms crossed, trying to look unimpressed, until the rhythm softened their posture. Some people sang with smiles, others sang like they were pushing a heavy door open. Then the prayers would rise. Not polite prayers, not, "Dear God, please bless the day" prayers. These were prayers with teeth. People prayed out loud, layered on top of each other, voices colliding, rising and falling like waves. Someone would shout a name, Jesus, again and again, not like a ritual, but like a grip. Some people would drop to their knees so fast the dust jumped. Some would press their foreheads into the ground as if they were trying to disappear into humility. Others would shake, not because someone told them to, but because fear had finally found a way out of their muscles. And Babalola, this is the part that startled even hardened skeptics, would often wait. He didn't rush to perform. He let the room boil. Because his entire ministry was built on a conviction that made both religious leaders and traditional power brokers uneasy. Repentance first, power after. He would speak, and the words would land like stones. Not academic sermons, not long poetic explanations, more like a diagnosis. He talked about sin with the seriousness of infection. He talked about forgiveness, like it was oxygen. He talked about spiritual bondage, the way a doctor talks about a disease that spreads through families. And then came the moment that turned his meetings into something people couldn't forget. The call to confess and abandon protections. That's where the air would go strange. Because Nigeria in that era, and honestly, Nigeria in many eras, was not only dealing with visible problems, people lived with invisible threats. Curses, jealousies, spiritual attacks, the dread that your success would attract hatred you couldn't fight with fists. So people carried things, small leather pouches tied under clothing, strings around waists. powdered mixtures wrapped in leaves. Objects hidden inside roofs, buried behind kitchens, tucked into mattresses. Some were harmless tradition. Some were the residue of real fear. And the people who sold them, let's be blunt, made sure you stayed afraid enough to keep buying. Babalola's preaching attacked that marketplace directly. He would say, in plain language, if you belong to Christ, you cannot keep one hand in the light and the other hand in the dark. And then, as if the message had been waiting inside people's chests for years, they would come forward, one by one. Not like proud heroes, like prisoners releasing contraband. They would reach into clothing, untie knots with trembling fingers, pull out pouches so worn and sweat-stained they looked like pieces of flesh. Some people cried before they even reached the fire. Some hesitated, staring at their own hands as if those objects might bite them. And when the fire took them, when the leather curled, when the feathers flared, when the smell rose sharp and nasty, something broke inside the crowd. It was half relief, half terror. Relief, because they were finally letting go. Terror, because letting go meant you were exposed. Unless God was real. That's the pressure Babalola created. His meetings forced a gamble. Either God would show up, or people would feel naked in the face of the invisible. This is exactly why his enemies hated him. Because a man who makes people burn their fear is a man who steals the currency of fear sellers. Reverend, his polished rival, the gatekeeper of respectable faith, understood that too. And now Reverend was no longer merely concerned. He was threatened. So he escalated. He began to trail the movement with words like poison. He's hypnotizing people. He's manipulating crowds. He's using superstition disguised as Christianity. He's going to get somebody killed. And here's the twist. Reverend wasn't entirely wrong to be afraid, just wrong about why, because crowds are volatile. A crowd can turn any spiritual meeting into chaos. A crowd can crush the weak. A crowd can become a rumor factory. A crowd can become a weapon. And Babalola's crowds began to swell. Not because he advertised like a modern influencer, but because of what people said happened after he prayed. The sick came. Not politely sick. Desperately sick. People carried others on mats, on wooden boards, on backs slick with sweat. You'd see someone with legs that looked like they belonged to a different person. Thin, dragging, unused. You'd see eyes too dull for a young face. You'd see mothers holding limp children with the kind of expression that isn't crying anymore because it's past tears. And Babalola would pray, sometimes with hands laid gently, sometimes from a short distance, voice firm, commanding, sometimes after long minutes of silence that felt unbearable. And then, this is the part that made the story explode across Yorubaland, some of those bodies changed in front of witnesses. A person who hadn't stood for a long time would stand and wobble like a newborn animal, shocking even themselves. A fevered child would stop burning and start sleeping peacefully. A man whose pain had turned him into a bitter ghost would suddenly start sobbing as if he'd been punched by mercy. Did every single person get healed? The human world is not that clean. But enough things happened, often enough, in public enough ways, that even the skeptics had to stop smirking so confidently. And when skeptics lose certainty, they become dangerous. That's when the second enemy stepped out more clearly. Not Reverend, but the men who claimed spiritual authority through traditional power networks. They didn't wear collars. They didn't argue doctrine. They used intimidation. They began sending challenges into the crowd. Plants, provocateurs, people who would come forward claiming to be sick but actually trying to trap him in failure. They attempted to lure him onto their ground, into places thick with old loyalties, hoping he'd stumble. And Babalola, instead of avoiding those places, walked into them. That's what made people whisper the word apostle with a different kind of weight. Not just preacher, not just healer. A man moving as if he believed he had a mandate. Then the movement hit its most combustible phase. Elasa. The name matters because the stories that came out of Elasa didn't just add to his reputation, they turned it into legend. The revival there didn't behave like a scheduled event. It behaved like a contagion, spreading house to house, street to street. People would hear singing in one compound and wander in. They'd hear prayers at night and drift closer like moths. Entire neighborhoods began to throb with the same question. What if God is actually doing something here? But revivals attract not only the hungry, they attract the opportunists. Men started showing up claiming to have the same power, trying to imitate what was happening. Some were sincere and confused. Others were outright competitors, spiritual merchants smelling profit. They wanted to attach their names to the fire without paying the price of discipline, repentance, and scrutiny. Babalola did not tolerate that. And here's where his personality, for better or worse, became a blade. He could be uncompromising to the point of frightening people, who came expecting a softer, safer faith. He would expose fakery publicly. He would rebuke leaders who tried to turn the movement into personal empire. He would insist on holiness, sexual purity, honesty, cutting off certain practices, like he believed compromise would poison the entire thing. Some loved him for that. Others began to fear him the way people fear a man who cannot be bribed. Reverend tried a new tactic. If you can't stop the revival, discredit its center. He began to spread a more sinister rumor, one designed not just to embarrass, but to terrify. That power isn't from God. That accusation worked like smoke. People would inhale it without realizing. Even some who had been helped started to wonder quietly late at night. What if I traded one fear for another? And that is how rivalries actually kill movements, not with one dramatic explosion, but with slow contamination. Babalola responded in the only way he knew, by raising the temperature even higher. He called for deeper prayer, longer fasting, night vigils that ran until dawn, repentance that wasn't merely emotional but practical, return stolen things, confess hidden crimes, reconcile broken families. And then came one of the most visually shocking patterns of those meetings, the destruction of what people considered spiritual anchors. More fires, more bundles, more objects that looked like they belonged in nightmares rather than homes. Some people didn't just bring personal charms. They brought items tied to family histories, things handed down like legacy and threat. They burned them with shaking hands, and the crowd reacted like a witness to surgery, fascination, horror, relief. And when enough people do that publicly, you create an irreversible social shift. Because now the community has to decide what story it tells itself. Were those things worthless all along? Or did we just declare war on the unseen? That question made the rivals frantic. Traditional spiritual leaders escalated intimidation into open hostility. They threatened people who attended the meetings. They warned, when the excitement fades, you will pay. And then the state began to notice, because huge crowds do not exist in a colonial context without raising alarms. Crowds mean unrest. Crowds mean potential rebellion. Crowds mean a leader who can move people with words, always suspicious. Officials started watching. Questions were asked. Reports were made. Some local authorities feared disorder, especially when gatherings lasted all night and the emotional intensity spilled into the streets. Now Babalola had a new kind of rival. Quiet, bureaucratic, cold. The fear of government control. And at the same time, another conflict was building inside the Christian world itself. Because as the revival grew, outside church organizations began to circle it. Some wanted to support. Some wanted to supervise. Some wanted to claim it. Foreign-linked mission structures saw opportunity and danger in the same breath. Opportunity to expand a Pentecostal wave. Danger. That indigenous leaders would not remain under external authority. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Offers were made. Alignments proposed. And Babalola, who had not asked to be a politician, found himself dragged into politics anyway. Here's the twist that breaks a lot of people's idealism. Spiritual power does not protect you from human power games. Sometimes it attracts them. Suddenly, it wasn't just Reverend attacking him from the outside. It was also allies trying to leash him from the inside. They wanted him to submit to structures that would legitimize him, meaning control him. They wanted the revival to fit a mold, to become predictable, administrable, reportable. But Babalola had never been predictable. He was a man whose earliest authority came from a terrifying encounter, not from a committee. And that difference set up a collision. The revival became not only a battle over miracles, it became a battle over ownership. Who owns the movement? Who speaks for God? Who decides what is acceptable Pentecostal practice in Nigeria? Reverend exploited this fracture like a professional. He began telling people, "Look, your prophet is being used. He's being manipulated. Soon you'll see he's just a tool." And when people started hearing whispers of internal disagreements, leaders arguing about doctrine, about authority, about the use of prayer methods, about discipline, some hearts began to wobble, because nothing disappoints a crowd like realizing the leaders are human. Babalola's response was to keep doing the work in front of him. He kept preaching, kept praying for the sick, kept calling people to repentance, kept urging believers to abandon fear-based religion. But the more he did it, the heavier the target on his back became. At one point, rivals attempted to provoke a public humiliation. A challenge was arranged. Carefully, like a trap baited with a sick body. A person was brought forward, not merely ill, but dramatically so, the kind of case that makes people whisper, "If he can't handle this one, it's over." Reverend supporters watched like judges. Traditionalists watched like hunters. Government watchers watched like accountants, counting the cost of disorder. Babalola stood there while the crowd hissed and murmured, hunger in their faces. And then, another twist. He did not perform. He stepped back and demanded the crowd quiet itself. He pressed them into stillness. It felt like someone turning down a boiling pot with bare hands. He prayed, but not in a frantic way, in a steady way. In a way that made some people uneasy because it looked like certainty. And when the person began to change, whether slowly or suddenly, depending on whose story you hear, something ugly happened in the crowd. It didn't only produce joy, it produced rage. Because for his enemies, that moment meant the trap had failed. And when a trap fails, the hunter becomes reckless. The backlash became more personal. He was accused of causing social disorder, of misleading people, of undermining established religious authority, and perhaps most painfully, he was accused of pride. Pride is the easiest accusation to throw at a man who won't be controlled. As the movement rolled forward, Babalola's internal life began to show the strain. The very discipline that made him powerful, long prayers, fasting, intensity, also made him isolated. He didn't live like an ordinary man anymore. He lived like someone who believed he was carrying a fire that could burn him if he held it wrong. And here's the darkest, most human turn of this part of the story. At the height of influence, when crowds were thick and his name felt unstoppable, he began to realize that the biggest threat was no longer outside. It was inside the movement. Because fame attracts parasites. Power attracts imitators. Revival attracts people who want the fruit without the root. Some leaders began to argue over credit. Some began to cut corners. Some began to treat miracles like a marketing strategy. Some used the atmosphere to build their own followings. Babalola confronted it, harshly, and that confrontation created fractures that never fully healed. He had become a symbol bigger than himself, bigger than any one man could carry safely. And as the movement entered formal organizational phases, alignments, churches, leadership structures, Babalola found himself pulled between two impossible expectations. Be the wild, uncompromising prophet people came to see, while also being the manageable leader institutions demanded. Reverend watched all of this with a thin smile. Because rivals don't always need to defeat you directly. Sometimes they just need to wait for the weight of your own movement to crush you. And Babalola, who had once fought fear sellers and skeptical clergy, now faced a more complex enemy, a spiritual empire forming around him, demanding pieces of him, turning his calling into a battlefield of egos. By the end of this phase, his name was everywhere. People were naming children after him. People were traveling long distances just to be in the same field where he prayed. Stories about healings and deliverances were spreading like wildfire. But behind the flames, cracks were showing, and Babalola could feel something coming, something colder than opposition, something quieter than rivalry, the kind of ending that doesn't arrive like thunder, but like exhaustion. The strangest thing about a fire is that it doesn't know when to stop. It burns through the wood you give it, yes, but it also burns through the hands that keep feeding it, the lungs that breathe its smoke, and the eyes that stare into it too long. By the late 1930s, Joseph Ayo Babalola was no longer merely a man walking from town to town. He had become a magnet. And when you become a magnet, you don't only pull in healing and hope. You pull in pressure. You pull in jealousy. You pull in people who want to wear your name like a crown, and people who want to crush your name like a snake. The revival wave had already carved a permanent scar across the religious landscape of Western Nigeria. Too many people had seen too much. Too many testimonies, real, exaggerated, contested, whispered, had piled on top of each other until the movement stopped looking like an event and started looking like a new reality. And reality is exactly what institutions try to manage. So structures hardened around him. Committees, councils, senior figures, men who loved order, men who feared disorder, men who could smell power the way dogs smell meat. They wanted agreements. They wanted boundaries. They wanted to decide who could preach, who could pray for the sick, who could claim spiritual gifts without embarrassing the respectable face of the church. On the surface, it sounded wise. Underneath, it was war. Quiet, holy-looking war. Because Babalola's rivals learned something painful. If they attacked him from the outside, the crowds defended him. If they accused him directly, the accusations bounced off the testimonies. So they changed strategy. They tried to isolate him by honoring him. They tried to wrap him in titles and procedures until the wildness of his calling couldn't breathe. And here came the next twist. Some of the hands pulling on him belonged to people who genuinely believed they were protecting the movement. Not everyone who opposed his intensity was evil. Some were terrified that mass healings and deliverance prayer, especially when mixed with ecstatic worship, could invite deception, fanaticism, or even violence. Some had seen spiritual charlatans copy the revival atmosphere and use it to exploit desperate people. Some feared that unregulated crowds could trigger government crackdowns. In other words, the rival forces weren't always wrong about the risks. They were wrong about the man. Because Babalola was not trying to build a circus. He was trying to build a people who believed God could be trusted more than fear. But now he faced an enemy he couldn't pray away like a fever, the slow, grinding machinery of religious politics. And for a man who once drove an actual machine, the steamroller, there was a cruel poetry in it. He had escaped one machine only to be caught in another. The old rival, Reverend, watched this with patient satisfaction, not always openly, not always with speeches, sometimes simply by aligning himself with those who wanted order, lending his credibility to the idea that Babalola needed guidance, discipline, oversight. Reverend didn't have to defeat him in front of a crowd anymore. He only had to make sure the movement's gatekeepers could keep the prophet behind the gate. And it began to work. Babalola's public presence shifted. He still preached, still prayed, still carried the severity that made people straighten their backs. But he was increasingly surrounded by rules. Where to go, when to speak, who could host him, how meetings should be conducted, what language should be used when reporting what happened. And then came another twist, quieter and more devastating. As the movement grew into a church body, gaining structures, buildings, recognized leadership, Babalola's own role became complicated. Because institutions love founders when founders are dead. When founders are alive, founders are inconvenient. A living founder can disagree. A living founder can refuse compromise. A living founder can embarrass the leadership by not playing the game. And Babalola, whether by temperament, conviction, or both, did not play the game well. He could be stubborn. He could be harsh. He could be so singularly focused on holiness that people around him felt judged just by standing near him. Even admirers sometimes struggled to live at the level of intensity he demanded. So the tension grew. The prophet and the administrators, the fire and the container. And in the private corners of that tension, the cost landed on Babalola's body. Years of fasting, relentless travel, night vigils, emotional labor, carrying other people's suffering like sacks of stones, does something to a human frame. Your heart is not a drum. It cannot be beaten forever. Your nerves are not iron. They fray. The same man who once stood like a pillar in the middle of roaring crowds began to show signs of strain, not always obvious to those who only saw him from a distance, but those close to him could sense it. The tiredness behind the eyes, the moments of withdrawal, the way he'd choose solitude over conversation, prayer over politics. He spent increasing time in places of retreat, quiet towns, familiar environments, especially in the Ekiti region, where he was associated strongly with Efon Alaye. There, the movement had deep roots, and the landscape itself, hills, bush paths, open air, fit his style of devotion. Even today, that geography matters to his legacy. It's not just where he lived, it's where the myth found a home. Meanwhile, the rivalries did not stop. Traditional spiritual authorities had not disappeared. They had simply adapted. Where they couldn't stop the Christian wave, they rebranded their services, sometimes even cloaking old fear in new religious language. The spiritual marketplace doesn't vanish, it changes packaging. And inside the church world, the competition for influence continued. Who would be seen as the legitimate heir of revival power? Who could claim the mantle? Who would control the narrative? If Babalola had wanted to build a dynasty, he could have. His name alone could have become a throne. But he didn't move like a dynasty builder. He moved like a man who believed the calling itself was the point. Even if it cost him comfort, even if it cost him popularity, even if it cost him control. That's why his ending, while not flashy, is so heavy. Because he didn't end as a celebrity surrounded by luxury. He ended as something closer to what he started as, a human being carrying a weight. In 1959, the fire finally reached the edge of his body. Accounts describe him falling ill. Again, the details are told in different ways by different people, because communities remember saints the way they remember storms, with emotion more than medical precision. But the outcome is firm. Joseph Ayo Babalola died in 1959 at only 55 years old. Let that number hit you properly. 55. That is not old. That is not a long life. That is the age when many men finally settle into stability, when grandchildren start appearing, when you start telling stories about the wild days as if they belonged to someone else. He didn't get that kind of retirement. He died while he was still a symbol, while his movement was still expanding, while the arguments around him were still alive. And death, in Nigeria, especially around a man like him, is never just death. Death is a referendum. When Babalola died, the question didn't vanish. It intensified. Was he truly sent by God, or was he a dangerous religious spark that burned too hot? His rivals, especially the respectable ones, expected the fire to cool. They assumed that without the prophet's physical presence, the movement would shrink back into normal church life. But something unexpected happened. The fire didn't die. It multiplied. Because here's the brutal truth about a figure like Babalola. Once people believe they have touched freedom from fear, they will not willingly return to chains. Not easily. Not quietly. So his death didn't end the story. It turned it into inheritance. The church body associated with his revival stream, especially the Christ Apostolic Church tradition that carried so much of that Aladura, Pentecostal energy, continued to grow and spread, shaping Nigeria's broader Pentecostal landscape for generations. The prayer culture he embodied, vigils, fasting, prayer mountains, deliverance-oriented spirituality, became not a fringe practice, but a defining flavor of Nigerian Christianity. And then, the most ironic twist of all, the institutions that struggled to contain him while he lived now had a saint-shaped space to fill. Because it is safer to celebrate a dead prophet than to obey a living one. So his memory became polished, not always accurately, sometimes too sweet, sometimes too simplified, but powerful. His name began to function like a key for people's faith. When Nigerians say they honor him, they don't only mean we respect history. They mean something more intimate. They mean this man represents a moment when heaven felt close. He became a symbol of spiritual seriousness, of a Christianity that didn't apologize for confronting fear, sickness, and the unseen, and the places tied to his life became spiritual landmarks. Efon Alaye, especially, became associated with pilgrimage-like devotion. People speak of prayer grounds and hills connected to his memory, places where believers go to pray with an intensity meant to echo his own. The logic is emotional more than logical. If a man once prayed here and power moved, then maybe the atmosphere still remembers. Whether you see that as faith, psychology, or cultural continuity, the result is the same. His legacy has geography. His legacy has ritual. His legacy has a living community that keeps retelling the story until it becomes part of the air. And what about Reverend? His rival, the voice of respectable caution. Here's the quiet ending to that rivalry. Reverend may have outmaneuvered him in committees. He may have influenced gatekeepers. He may have shaped how leaders spoke about order. But he did not win the people's imagination, because imagination is not controlled by bureaucracy. The people remembered what they felt in those meetings: fear breaking, hope rising, the sense that the invisible world could be confronted. Without charms, without blood pacts, without paying fear tax to spiritual merchants. So even if Reverend remained respected in his own circles, the movement's mythic center drifted toward Babalola anyway, not because Babalola was perfect, but because he was unmistakable, and that is why Nigeria still honors him. He became a national symbol of spiritual power without Western permission. In a colonial-era context, where legitimacy often came stamped from outside, Babalola represented something indigenous and forceful, an African Christian authority that didn't ask to be approved. He confronted the economy of fear. People didn't only follow him because of miracles. They followed him because his message offered an exit from spiritual dependence, an invitation to trust God rather than objects, rituals, and hidden contracts. He helped shape a distinctly Nigerian Pentecostal style of Christianity: prayer as warfare, fasting as discipline, healing as expected, not exceptional, holiness as demand, not suggestion. That pattern didn't start with him alone, but his life became one of its clearest stories. He embodied sacrifice. A man who leaves stability, absorbs public hatred, and keeps moving, then dies relatively young, fits the human template for holy man, not because suffering automatically equals holiness, but because it proves he wasn't doing it for comfort. Yet, there's one more layer, and it's the one people rarely say out loud because it's too raw. Nigeria honors Babalola because his story is a mirror of Nigeria's hunger. Hunger for a God who feels present in the middle of chaos. A mirror of Nigeria's dread of the unseen, dread of sudden loss. A mirror of Nigeria's courage, the courage to step forward, trembling, and burn what you used to worship. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the mixed emotions still in the way people talk about him. Admiration, because he broke chains. Suspicion, because power always scares people. A little disgust, because the things people burned were ugly reminders of what fear can make humans do. And satisfaction, because the story delivers exactly what it promises. A man who went from road dust to revival thunder. He died in 1959. But the sound of that steamroller stopping, of a life forced off one track and onto another, never really faded. It just echoed forward, into churches filled with night prayers, into hills where people still cry out before dawn, into families who still say, if God could use Babalola, then God can intervene for us too. Because in the end, that's what his life became in the Nigerian imagination. Not just a biography, a dare. A dare to believe that fear is not the final authority,